My name is Nora Fielding. I am 31 years old. And the morning my great-aunt handed me an envelope at her kitchen table and said, not loudly, not dramatically, just plainly, the way she said everything, "This is for the one who always came back." I did not understand yet what I was holding. I understood 3 days later. Standing in a bank in rural Derbyshire, in a room with no windows, while a woman named Patricia Holt sat across from me with both hands flat on the desk and said 4 words in a voice that had gone very careful. This is completely real. My family spent the following year trying to prove it wasn't. And what they did to prove it told me everything I had spent 31 years pretending not to know about the people I had been raised alongside. But I am getting ahead of myself. Because the beginning of this story is not in a bank. It is in a kitchen that smelled of dried lavender and something sweet underneath, on a January afternoon when the light came in low and amber through windows that had not been properly cleaned since 1987, and a woman named Agnes Fielding was sitting in her usual chair by the radiator, knitting something she would not show me, and asking me about my students. She always asked about my students first. Agnes Fielding was my grandmother's younger sister. She had never married. She had never left the village of Beckton, which sits in a valley in Derbyshire between 2 hills that are not dramatic enough to be famous and not gentle enough to be forgettable. She had lived in the same stone cottage for 53 years. She had a kitchen garden she maintained with a seriousness that bordered on professional. She had a cat named Ptolemy who was 17 years old and regarded the world with the exhausted contempt of someone who had seen everything twice. She had been a primary school teacher for 34 years. She had retired at 67 and spent the following 20 years doing roughly what she had always done, which was paying close attention to things that other people considered unremarkable. I started visiting her when I was 23. Not because anyone suggested it. Not because I was asked. I had just finished my teacher training and moved to a town 15 miles from Beckton. And one Sunday in October I drove out on no particular impulse and knocked on her door, and she opened it and looked at me for a moment and said, "You better come in then. The tea's just made." That was the beginning. I came back the following Sunday. And the Sunday after that. For 8 years I came on Sundays. Not every single one. There were weeks when life interrupted, weeks when school was consuming everything, weeks when I was ill or tired or simply could not make the drive. But most of them. Enough of them that Ptolemy stopped giving me the contempt look and started simply ignoring me, which from him was practically affection. We talked about my students. She talked about hers, the ones from 30 years ago, the ones she still thought about, the ones who had sent her letters, the ones who had not. She talked about her garden. I talked about mine, which was smaller and significantly less successful. She talked about books. I talked about books. We argued gently about authors. We agreed about almost everything else. She made tea in a brown ceramic pot that had belonged to her mother. She used loose leaves and a strainer that was slightly bent on one side. The tea was always exactly right. Once, in my second year of visiting, I asked her whether she was lonely. She considered the question seriously, the way she considered everything. She said, I am sometimes alone. That is different." I wrote that down when I got home. I still have it. What I did not know during those 8 years of Sunday visits, what I had absolutely no reason to suspect, was that Agnes Fielding, retired primary school teacher, lifelong resident of a village in Derbyshire, keeper of a mediocre cat and an excellent garden, had been quietly and methodically building something for the better part of 4 decades. I did not know because I never asked about her finances. It would not have occurred to me to ask. She lived simply. She wore the same green wax jacket to the shops every week. She drove a car that was 11 years old and had a crack in the passenger side mirror she had been meaning to get fixed since 2019. She grew her own vegetables because she enjoyed it, not because she had to. I visited her because she was interesting and kind, and because she asked about my students and meant it. That was all. That was the whole reason. I did not know it was also the reason for everything that came after. The first sign that something was changing came in the September before the Thanksgiving, before what my family would later call, in various ways and with various degrees of grievance, the incident. Agnes had seemed tired in a way that was different from ordinary tiredness. Not dramatic. Not the kind of tiredness that announces itself. The quiet kind. The kind that lives just below the surface of a person's ordinary movements and makes everything take a fraction longer than it used to. I noticed when she stood up from her chair. A small pause before she committed to the movement. A hand on the armrest that had not always been necessary. I did not mention it. She had not mentioned it. That was how we were with each other, direct about most things, careful about the things that required a person's own timing. In October, she asked me something that seemed at the time like one of her oblique questions, the kind she asked when she was thinking about something that was not quite the surface question. She said, "If you came into a significant sum of money tomorrow, what would you do first?" I thought about it. I said, "It probably fixed the roof on my classroom building. The bucket in the corner has been there since March." She looked at me with an expression I could not entirely read. Something between amusement and something else. She said, "Yes. That sounds right." She did not explain what she meant. I did not ask. We went back to our tea. In November, she told me she had been to see her doctor. She told me the way she told me most things, directly, without softening it unnecessarily, but also without making it larger than it needed to be. She said the name of what she had. She said the stage. She said she had known since August. I sat with it for a moment. I asked, "A treatment?" She shook her head. "I have had a very full life, Nora. I would like to spend what remains of it here. In this kitchen. In that garden. Not in a hospital." She had already spoken to a solicitor. She had already made arrangements for end-of-life care. She had, she said, been sorting for some time. She reached across and put her hand over mine. Her hand was cool and steady. She said, "I have one thing to ask you." I waited. She said, "Don't tell the others yet. I want Christmas to be Christmas. I do not want your grandmother spending December writing a speech about me." She smiled slightly. "I want one more roast dinner. One more argument about the gravy. One more year of pretending your uncle knows anything about wine." She paused. "Besides," she said, and something shifted in her expression, "I have a few things to settle first. It is going to be a rather interesting Christmas." Nothing Agnes Fielding ever said was accidental. I drove home that night holding the steering wheel carefully and did not sleep until past 2 in the morning. My family arrived at Agnes's cottage on Christmas Eve with the particular energy of people who have decided, without discussing it, that this year is the year something important will be clarified. My grandmother Bea arrived first. Bea was Agnes's older sister by 4 years, and had spent most of those 4 years being slightly disappointed in Agnes for reasons that shifted depending on the decade. In the 60s, it had been Agnes's decision not to marry. In the 80s, it had been Agnes's decision to stay in Beckton instead of moving somewhere more substantial. In the year since, it had settled into a general ambient dissatisfaction that Bea wore like a favorite coat, familiar, comfortable, absolutely not coming off. My uncle Stuart arrived with his wife Pauline and their son Marcus, who was 29 and worked in property development and had the handshake of a man who practiced it. Marcus had visited Agnes perhaps 4 times in his adult life. He remembered her birthday by having his assistant remind him to send a card. He kissed her on the cheek when he arrived and called her Auntie Ag in a voice that managed to be both affectionate and slightly condescending. My mother arrived separately from my father, which had been their arrangement for 3 years and which nobody in the family had directly addressed. My mother Claire was Agnes's niece, B.A.'s daughter, and had a relationship with Agnes that I would describe as transactional warmth. She was warm when she wanted something. She was civil the rest of the time. My father, Gordon, arrived last, carrying wine he had clearly bought from a petrol station and presenting it with the confidence of a man who does not read labels. He sat down at the table and immediately began talking about something that had happened at work in a way that made clear he intended to talk about it for some time. Agnes moved between the kitchen and the table in her usual way, unhurried, precise, noticing everything. She had made a roast. The kitchen smelled of it. She had set the table with the good plates, the ones with the blue border, that she brought out 4 times a year. She caught my eye once across the room. She looked like a woman who was in on something. After dinner, when the plates had been pushed back and the wine had done its usual work on the table's general civility, Agnes stood up. She did it slowly, one hand on the table, and the conversation did not stop immediately because the conversation never stopped immediately for Agnes. It stopped when she cleared her throat in the small precise way she had, a single quiet note, like a tuning fork struck once. The table went quiet. She said, I have something I would like to give each of you. From the sideboard behind her she brought a wooden box. Not large, the size of a showbox, darker wood, a small brass catch. She opened it and took out 5 envelopes. Cream-colored. Sealed with her characteristic precision. She walked around the table and placed one beside each person. Mine was last. When she set it down, she touched my shoulder once, briefly, and went back to her chair. My uncle Stuart opened his first. I watched his face. He read it once. Then again. Then he laughed, not a warm laugh, a sharp one, the kind that is meant to establish that the person laughing has decided how to feel about something. Agnes, he said. What is this? It is what it appears to be, she said. Marcus had opened his. His expression moved through several things quickly. Are these zeros real? My grandmother B.A. had not opened hers yet. She was watching Agnes with an expression I could not read. My mother opened hers. She looked at it for a long moment. Something crossed her face, something genuine and brief, and then it was replaced by the careful neutrality she wore when she was deciding what to think. My father read his and said, Is this a joke, Agnes? This is some kind of joke. He said it flatly. Not unkindly, but flatly. With the confidence of someone who has decided that the simplest explanation is the correct one. Stuart said, Dad's right. This isn't a real check. Marcus turned his over. Examined the back. The security strip looks printed. This is novelty paper. B.A. said nothing. My mother folded hers in half and set it beside her wine glass. Agnes, honestly, we're too old for games. Stuart pushed his across the table. It slid off the edge and landed face down on the floor, and he did not pick it up. Marcus put his in the inside pocket of his jacket and then, thinking better of it, took it out and left it on the table. My father held his for another moment, looking at it. Then he put it in his shirt pocket in the way a person puts something in their pocket when they want to deal with it later. I noticed this. I stored it. I had not yet opened mine. I opened it now. The cheque was from a bank I knew. A branch in Derby that I had driven past 100 times. The account name was Agnes Mary Fielding. The amount was written in her careful handwriting, both in figures and in words, the way she had been taught to write cheques in 1962 and had never stopped. £300,000. On the back, in her blue ink, for the one who always came back. I folded it once. I put it in my coat pocket. I looked at Agnes. She was watching me. Only me. The rest of the table was still talking, my uncle's voice rising slightly, my mother saying something careful, Marcus asking whether anyone had the name of a good solicitor. I said, thank you. She nodded. Once. Small. Exact. Nobody else noticed. I drove home that night in the dark with the cheque in my coat pocket and my hands steady on the wheel and something sitting in my chest that was not quite any single emotion, but was composed of many of them layered over each other the way geological strata are layered, grief and relief and a specific kind of love that has no clean name. I did not go to a bank that night. I sat at my kitchen table under the overhead light, and I took the cheque out and I looked at it for a long time. The paper was heavy. When I held it to the light, the security watermark moved the way only real documents move. On the back, her handwriting. For the one who always came back. I turned it over. I turned it back. I made tea I did not drink. I thought about the September afternoon 3 months earlier when she had asked me what I would do with money, and I had said I would fix the roof on my classroom building because the bucket in the corner had been there since March. I thought about her expression when I said it. Like someone checking an answer against a key they had been holding for years. I went to bed at midnight. I did not sleep until 3. In the morning I drove to the bank in Derby. The branch manager's name was Gerald O'Say. He was a careful man, precise and unhurried, with reading glasses he wore on a cord around his neck. He had worked at that branch for 19 years. He had a small succulent on his desk that he had clearly been cultivating for some time. He looked at the cheque. He looked at it for a while. He looked up at me. He said, Miss Fielding. Can you come with me a moment? He led me to a small room at the back of the branch. A table. 2 chairs. He closed the door. He said, Your great-aunt came in to see me in October. He said it carefully. The way people say things when the thing they are saying is the smaller part of a larger thing. He said, This cheque is real. The funds exist. He paused. He said, There is also a solicitor named Elspeth Crane who has asked to be in contact with you. I am not able to say more than that. But I would suggest calling her today. He slid her card across the table. I sat in the car park for 11 minutes before I drove home. I had been visiting Agnes on Sundays for 8 years because she was interesting and asked about my students and made good tea. I was only now beginning to understand that she had been watching me for all of them. Before I tell you what Elspeth Crane told me, if this story is reaching you, please like and subscribe. Drop a comment with your location and what time it is where you are. I read every single one. Now let me take you back to the week everything came apart. It took 48 hours for my family to stop calling the cheque a novelty item and start calling it a matter of family principle. The first call came from my Uncle Stuart at 7:43 in the morning 2 days after Christmas. I know the time because I was still in bed and I looked at the screen and thought, nothing good has ever been delivered at 7:43 in the morning. He said, I need to understand what's happening with Agnes's money. I said, good morning, Stuart. He said, don't be clever, Nora. We all know she's not well. She's been making decisions she doesn't fully understand. This needs to be addressed as a family. I said, I'll speak to the solicitor. He said, you'll speak to me first. I said, I'll speak to the solicitor. And I ended the call. My mother called at 9. Her voice had the quality it got when she was performing reasonableness, slightly too measured, slightly too warm, the verbal equivalent of a handshake that goes on a beat too long. She said, darling, I just want to make sure you understand what this looks like from the outside. Agnes is elderly. She's not well. If she's been influenced, without meaning to be, it reflects badly on everyone, including you. I said, Agnes is the sharpest person I have ever met. My mother said, well. Which was her way of disagreeing without committing to it. Marcus sent a text at 11. It said, let's be adults about this. Split 5 ways makes more sense legally anyway. Just saying. My father had not called. I thought about the way he had put his check in his shirt pocket and then not taken it out again. I thought about what that meant. I forwarded all 3 communications to Elspeth Crane with a single message, for the record. She replied with a thumbs up emoji and one sentence, do not respond to any of them directly. Everything threw me from here. I did not respond to any of them directly. I called Agnes instead. She answered on the second ring. I could hear Ptolemy somewhere in the background making a noise of profound dissatisfaction about something. I said, it's started. She said, yes. I expected Tuesday. She said, are you all right? I said, I'm fine. She said, good. Come on Sunday. I'll make the good biscuits. That was Agnes. The weeks that followed had a particular quality, the quality of waiting for something you cannot prevent but also cannot rush. I went to school. I taught my class. I marked books in the evenings. I called Elspeth Crane twice a week. Elspeth was a solicitor from a firm in Sheffield with a reputation that, I learned later, made opposing solicitors slightly more careful in their correspondence. She was 54. She wore the same 3 blazers in rotation. She communicated by email with the efficiency of someone who charges by the hour and has made peace with it. She told me in our first meeting what Agnes had actually built. Agnes had inherited a small amount of money from her own parents in the 1980s. Rather than spend it or leave it in a savings account, she had done something that for a primary school teacher in rural Derbyshire in 1987 was genuinely unusual. She had invested it. Carefully. With the seriousness she applied to everything. She had found a financial advisor through a magazine she liked. She had written him a letter. He had written back. They had corresponded for 20 years. He had died in 2009 and left her a small stake in his firm's investment fund. She had never told anyone. Not because she was secretive by nature, but because nobody had ever asked. Not once. In 40 years of family dinners and Christmas gatherings and birthday calls and Sunday lunches, not a single member of her family had asked Agnes Fielding about her financial situation in a way that was genuinely curious rather than preparatory. Elspeth slid a single sheet of paper across the desk. I looked at the number at the bottom. I set the paper back down. I said, how long has she had this? Elspeth said, the base has been building since 1987. It compounded well. She was patient. I said, she never said anything. Elspeth said, she said to me once that nobody had ever asked about the investments. She said, they asked about my pension because they wanted to know if I was going to need money from them. Nobody asked about the rest because it did not occur to them that there was a rest. She folded her hands. She said, she was not bitter about it. She said it in the way a person states a fact about the weather. I looked out of the window. The Sheffield street was grey and ordinary. I said, what did she do with it? Elspeth said, she lived simply. She gave away more than you know. And she decided, about 3 years ago, what should happen to the majority of it. She slid another sheet across. I read it. I was very quiet for a moment. Then I said, she kept this for 3 years without telling me. Elspeth said, she kept it for 3 years without telling anyone. That was rather the point. Agnes's hip gave way on a Tuesday in February. She had been in the garden at dawn, which was when she always went to the garden, to check the state of things before the day made demands. She slipped on a patch of frost on the stone path. She was on the ground for over an hour before her neighbour, a retired postman named Arthur, who had been quietly keeping an eye on her for 2 years without either of them acknowledging this arrangement, noticed her kitchen light still on at 8 and knocked. The hospital wanted to admit her. She wanted to go home. She went home. Elspeth had filed the necessary paperwork 3 months earlier. Agnes had signed everything she needed to sign at a time when she was, as 3 separate capacity assessments would confirm, entirely and precisely herself. I asked for compassionate leave from school. My head teacher, a quiet woman named Mrs. Below, who had known me for 6 years and communicated primarily through very small nods, said, take what you need. That was all. I moved into Agnes's spare room. It had a low ceiling and a quilt her mother had made and a small bookshelf of Agatha Christie novels that Agnes had read so many times the spines had lost their colour. I set up a baby monitor on her nightstand. Arthur from next door brought soup twice a week without being asked. He left it on the doorstep in a container he had labelled with masking tape, Soup, Tuesday, A. The family visited in the order they had always visited, which is to say, in the order of what they expected to get from it. Stuart came once. He sat in the kitchen for 20 minutes and talked about logistics. Agnes listened politely. When he left, she said, he was always more interested in the outcome than the journey. She said it without malice, with the mild precision of a woman describing a species. Marcus sent a card. It arrived 3 weeks after it was dated. My mother visited twice. The first visit was uncomfortable. The second one, 6 weeks later, was less so. She sat at the kitchen table and drank tea and did not try to steer the conversation anywhere. That was something. Maybe it was enough. My father did not visit. I read to Agnes in the evenings. She liked Penelope Fitzgerald. She liked the poet Elizabeth Jennings. She liked a particular biography of a Victorian engineer that she had read 5 times and still found things in. On a Wednesday in early March, she asked me to open the small bureau drawer by her bed. Inside was a brass key on a green ribbon. She pressed it into my hand. She said, when Elspeth calls you, give this to her. She knows what it opens. I said, Auntie Agnes. She said, not yet. But soon. And that's all right. Agnes Fielding died on the 14th of March at 6:20 in the morning. I know the time because I was awake. I had been awake for an hour, sitting in the chair beside her bed, and I had been watching the light through the curtains change from black to the particular dark blue that comes just before dawn. The room went very still. Ptolemy, who had been asleep on the end of the bed, lifted his head. He looked at her for a moment. Then he looked at me. Then he lay back down. I sat for a while. I listened to the morning beginning outside. A wood pigeon somewhere. A car on the road at the bottom of the valley. Then I called Elspeth. She arrived within the hour. She sat in the chair across from mine. She had known Agnes for 11 years. She did not try to fill the silence. I called my grandmother B.A. She did not speak for a long moment when I told her. Then she said, she always did things on her own schedule. And her voice cracked, just slightly, on the last word. I called my mother. My mother's first words, after a pause, were, when will the will be read? Your grandmother's going to want to know. I said I would be in touch with Elspeth's office. I hung up. The funeral was the following Saturday. Agnes had left written instructions. She wanted to be buried in the churchyard of the small chapel at the edge of Beckton, beside her parents. She wanted no organ music, just one hymn sung plainly. She wanted Elspeth to read a passage from her favourite book. She did not want a reception afterward. She wanted, as she had put it in her instructions with characteristic directness, people to go home and have a good meal and talk about something other than her. They all came. They wore black and carried the specific grief of people who are also thinking about something else. Holland filmed nothing because this was Agnes and Agnes would have minded. At the graveside, Ptolemy appeared from somewhere and sat at the edge of the gathering and watched the proceedings with his usual contempt. Nobody could explain how he had got there. Arthur from next door stood at the back. He had brought flowers from his own garden, which was not yet in season, so he had brought branches instead, rosemary and evergreen, the kind of thing you bring when what you are really bringing is the fact of having shown up. I read a poem. I do not remember deciding to keep it together. I just did. My mother sat on my left. My father had not come. Nobody had mentioned this. I had asked Arthur to come. He sat at the end of the table in his good coat and his garden-worn hands folded on the table in front of him, looking like a man who had been asked to a meeting he did not fully understand but had come to anyway because he had been asked. Agnes had asked him to be there. That was reason enough. Elspeth sat at the head. She opened a dark green folder. She put on her reading glasses. She did not look at any of us. She read the preamble. She read through the specific bequests, Ptolemy to Arthur, the Christie collection to the village library, the garden tools to the horticultural society, the Victorian engineering biography to the primary school in Beckton. Stuart's jaw was already set. She read, the principal remainder of the estate, comprising the cottage at 14 Larkspur Lane, Beckton, the surrounding 1.4 acres, all investment accounts, and all remaining personal effects, valued at approximately £1.8 million net of the gifts already distributed. The bay tree in the courtyard caught the light and held it. The testator leaves the entirety of this remainder to her great-niece, Nora Catherine Fielding. Nobody spoke. The bay tree. The light. Stuart said, I'm sorry. Elspeth said, I'll read the attached explanatory statement. She adjusted her glasses. I leave this to Nora because she came. Not because she was asked. Not because she wanted something. She came on Sundays because she was interested in me as a person and I was interested in her as a person. And this kind of relationship is, in my experience, the rarest thing there is. She never asked what I had. She never suggested how I might use it. She asked about my garden and my cat and my students from 30 years ago, and she told me about her students from last week, and this is what love looks like when it has not been confused with expectation. Elspeth looked up briefly, then back down. I have watched my family for many decades. I do not say this with bitterness. I say it with the clear-eyed affection of a person who has had a long time to see things plainly. They are not wicked people. They are people who, at some point, stopped being curious about me and started being interested in what I might represent. This happens in families. It is very human. But it meant that the person at the table who asked about my students and meant it was always Nora. And so Nora is who I have chosen. The room was quiet. Elspeth folded the paper. My grandmother B.A. was looking at the table. Her face was doing something complicated. Marcus said, This is contestable. Undue influence is a recognized ground for. Elspeth said, a Mr. Fielding Hall. Your great-aunt underwent 3 separate capacity assessments over a period of 3 years, each conducted by an independent clinical psychologist, each concluding full testamentary capacity. The most recent was performed 11 weeks before her death. I also have affidavits from 3 individuals, including a medical professional, attesting to her clarity of mind and the deliberateness of her decisions. I would suggest that any attempt to contest on the grounds of undue influence would be, at significant legal cost to you, unsuccessful. She closed the green folder. She said, if there are no further questions, I will ask you to sign the acknowledgement forms and we will proceed from there. Stuart looked at me. I did not look away. He looked back at the table. My mother sat very still beside me. She was not performing. For a moment she just looked like herself. The challenge arrived 11 days later. A letter. Heavy envelope. A firm in Manchester I had not heard of. Filed on behalf of Stuart Fielding, Marcus Fielding Hall, and Claire Norwood, my mother, on the grounds of undue influence and lack of capacity. I sat on the kitchen floor of the cottage that was now technically mine and laughed a laugh that was not a good laugh. I called Elspeth. She said, I expected this on the 8th day. She said, I will represent you. I represented Agnes. I will see this through. She paused. She said, you should know that the safe deposit box you opened last week contains everything we need. She was thorough. She was, in fact, almost supernaturally thorough. I have been doing this for 26 years and I have never seen documentation this complete. The safe had contained 3 things. The first was the capacity assessments. 3 of them. Clean and dated and signed. The second was a bundle of letters. Every card I had sent Agnes going back to my first Christmas visit when I was 23. She had kept them all. She had labelled them in pencil on the backs by year. I counted them sitting on the bedroom floor. 61. The third was a small notebook. Green, soft-cornered, bound with a piece of garden twine she had replaced at least once. I opened it on the floor. Every page was a date. And a few words. Sunday, 4th of February, 2018. Nora came. We argued about Fitzgerald. She was right. Sunday, 8th of March, 2020. Nora came despite the snow. Ptolemy approved of her for the first time. Marked occasion. Sunday, 15th of September, 2022. Nora came. Told me about a boy in her class who would not read aloud. We talked for 2 hours about what he might need. She will figure it out. Every Sunday I had come. Every single one, going back 8 years. 312 entries. On page 47 there was a small pressed flower. A forget-me-not, blue and faded. Underneath in her handwriting, Nora brought these. Said she grew them. Garden improving. I sat on the bedroom floor of that cottage for a long time. Ptolemy came and sat beside me and pressed his old grey head briefly against my arm and then withdrew it, having apparently decided that was sufficient. I cried. Properly. The way I had not let myself cry since March 14th. She had counted every Sunday. I said, "You're a boy in my class." Years ago. She asked about him once and kept asking until I told her he'd learned to read aloud. The courtroom was quiet. Recorder Miles wrote something on her notepad. She looked up. She said, "If the court finds the will valid as executed, the challenge is dismissed. Applicants to bear respondents' reasonable legal costs." Elspeth put her hand briefly on my arm. I did not look at Stuart or Marcus. I looked at the window. Outside, the October sky was very blue. My uncle Stuart said something in the corridor outside the courtroom that a journalist from the local paper heard and noted. He said, "Is she manipulated a lonely old woman and now she's laughing all the way to the bank?" He said it at a volume he perhaps intended only for Marcus, but the corridor was marble, and marble, as I have since learned, is not a friend to anger. The journalist was a young woman with a press badge and a small notebook. She did not look away. She made a note. I kept walking. Elspeth steered me gently by the elbow. I did not stop. I did not respond. The story ran in the local paper for days later. It was factual and measured. Stuart's words appeared in a pull quote. Below the pull quote was a detail the journalist had included because she was, apparently, thorough. Mr. Fielding's property development firm entered voluntary administration in September. It was not a vindictive detail. It was a journalist doing her job. But small towns read papers carefully, and the people who had known Agnes Fielding for 40 years read this one with particular attention. I am not going to describe in detail what happened to each of them afterward. They are people, not cautionary tales. They had their own reckoning to manage in their own ways, and most of it happened quietly, without my involvement, in the ordinary course of time and consequence. What I will tell you is what happened to me. I stayed in the cottage for one winter. I could not leave it yet. It smelled of Agnes and of stone and of the garden coming in through the windows she had always left cracked, even in November, because she liked to hear the birds. Ptolemy stayed with Arthur next door but visited most mornings. He had his own logic about these things. I kept teaching. I drove the 15 miles to school 5 days a week and I taught my class, and in the evenings I sat in Agnes's kitchen and drank tea from the brown ceramic pot and read the books from her shelves. I met with Elspeth in December. We set up a fund. Agnes had left a note in her bureau, separate from the will, specifying what she hoped would happen to the money she was leaving. She had not made it a legal requirement because, she wrote, she did not believe in telling people what to do with what they had inherited. She believed in stating what she hoped, and trusting. She hoped that something would be done for the school. Not her school. She had been retired for 20 years. The school in Beckton. The primary school that served the village and the surrounding farms. The school that had been losing teaching staff for 3 years because the funding had not kept pace with the need. I called the head teacher in January. His name was Mr. Patel. He was 42 and had been running the school for 7 years on a budget that required what he called creative arithmetic. I told him what I had in mind. He was quiet for a moment. He said, "Miss Fielding, the art supply budget for this year was £200. I said, I know." He said, £200 for 91 children. I said, I know. He said, what you're describing would change things. I said, that's what I'm hoping. We set up the Agnes Fielding Education Fund through Elspeth's firm. Endowed with £800,000. Interest allocated annually to Beckton Primary for staffing, supplies, and what Mr. Patel called the milk problem, the small, persistent daily needs of children whose families could not always cover them. The first allocation went out in March. Mr. Patel sent me a photograph of the new art supplies. 91 sets of coloured pencils in a storage unit he had built himself from flat pack, lined up in rows. I kept it on my phone for 6 months. I still have it. In the spring, I found something in Agnes's bureau that I had not found before. Behind the false back of the bottom drawer, a slim notebook that had slipped beneath the liner. Each page was a year, and a column, and a number. 1991, Beckton Primary. Milk Programme. £340. 1992, Beckton Primary. Milk Programme. £380. Books £220. 1993, Milk £400. Library refurbishment contribution £600. It went on for 32 years. The running total in her handwriting at the bottom of the last page was £214,800. She had been feeding the school since 1991. Quietly. Anonymously. Without telling anyone. Not even me. I sat on the floor of her bureau room for a long time. Outside, the first of the spring birds had arrived. I could hear them through the open window. The garden was beginning. She had fed the school for 32 years. She had fed it through the years when my mother was complaining about Agnes at Christmas dinner. She had fed it through the years when Stuart was talking about logistics at her table. She had fed it through every Sunday I had come, every cup of tea, every conversation about books and students and the garden. She had been quietly, methodically, at great and invisible personal cost, holding things up. And nobody had known. Nobody had thought to ask. My grandmother B.A. came to the cottage in May. She had not been inside it since Agnes's funeral, and she stood in the doorway for a moment as if she was checking whether she was allowed in. I made tea. I did not say much. She sat at the kitchen table in Agnes's chair and looked around the room the way a person looks around a room they knew in another life. She said, she was always better at this than me. I did not ask what she meant. She said, I was jealous of her when we were young. She was the one who knew what to do with things. With people. She always knew what to do. She picked up her cup. She set it down. She said, she left me a letter. Elspeth gave it to me at the reading. I did not open it for 2 months. She paused. She said, she said she forgave me. She said she had forgiven me for most of my life. She said I had been afraid and that being afraid had made me unkind sometimes and that she understood it because she had been afraid too, once, and had found other ways through it. B.A. looked at her tea. She said, I did not deserve that letter. I said, she thought you did. B.A. was quiet for a long moment. She said, you are very like her. I said, I hope so. She stayed for an hour. She did not ask about the money. She did not ask about the house or the fund or any of the logistics. She drank 2 cups of tea and talked about Agnes and left. At the door she turned and said, she was proud of you. She told me at Christmas 2 years ago. She said, Nora is the one who will be all right. She walked down the path without looking back. I stood in the doorway for a moment. Ptolemy appeared from Arthur's garden and sat on the path and looked at me with his old yellow eyes. I said, I know. He went back through the hedge. The only real conversation I had with my mother after everything was on a Tuesday in November. She drove up from Birmingham unannounced. She knocked the way strangers knock, twice, soft. I let her in. I made tea. She sat at the table. She did not perform anything. That was the difference. She said, I want to apologize. Not because of the money. Not because of the laureate. Because I have been watching how you do things for 31 years, and I have been calling it naive, and it was not naive. It was just different from how I do things. She looked at her cup. She said, she left me a letter. Agnes did. She said, she said she hoped I would find my way to being curious about people again. She said I had been curious once, when I was young, and that something had calcified over it, and that she believed it could uncalcify if I let it. She looked up. She said, I don't know how to ask you for anything that isn't transactional. I'm trying to learn how. I looked at her. My mother, without the performance. I said, that's something. She said, good. The children here need teachers who know what that's like. I got the job. My classroom has a window that looks out over the Derbyshire hills. On clear days you can see the edge of the valley where Beckton sits. I have a student named Thomas who does not speak in group work but writes with a precision that makes me hold my breath. I give him patience. I give him time. I have told him, once, that I had a student once who was like him, and that student learned to read aloud in the spring, and I still think about him. Thomas looked at me. He said, what's his name? I said, Daniel. He thought about this for a moment. He said, what happened to him? I said, I don't know. I hope he's all right. Thomas nodded. He went back to his writing. I have the 61 cards Agnes kept in the safe. I keep them in a box on the shelf in the spare room of the cottage. Some evenings I take one out and read it. The early ones, from when I was 23 and had only just learned how to write to a person who deserved a real letter, are embarrassing in the way that early letters always are. You can see the person learning how to be. The later ones are better. On the back of one of them, from about 4 years into the visits, Agnes had written a single line in her slanted blue ink. Not in response to anything I had written, just a note to herself, filed with the letter. It said, "This one has learned to sit with things. Very good. Very rare. I found it in January. I am still sitting with it. If there is one thing I want to leave you with, and I will be brief, because the true things are always brief, it is this. There is a specific kind of love that does not announce itself. It does not send flowers on the right occasions. It does not make speeches. It does not know the right things to say at funerals because it is not performing being present. It is simply present, in the ordinary and unremarkable way that presence actually looks when it is real. It comes on Sundays. It asks about the students. It drinks the tea even when it is slightly too strong. It argues about books and means it. It notices the trembling hand and says nothing, because the person with the trembling hand did not ask to have it noticed, only to have company while it trembled. This kind of love does not know it is being remarkable. That is what makes it remarkable. Agnes watched her family for 40 years. She was not bitter. She was clear-eyed and affectionate, and she understood that people love in the ways they know how to love, and that what they knew was not always enough, and that this was human and sad and not something to be punished. But she also understood that the person who came on Sundays for no reason was doing something different. Was being someone different. She had kept a notebook of it. 312 Sundays. I want to tell you something I did not know until I sat on her bedroom floor counting them. I had thought I was coming to visit her. I had thought I was doing something kind, something low stakes, something easy, just driving over, just having tea, just being interested in a person who was interesting. I had not understood that I was building something. That she was building something. That what we were doing together across 8 years of ordinary Sundays was constructing something as solid and load-bearing as one of my grandfather's bridges, something that would hold weight when weight was placed on it. You do not have to know you are building something for it to be built. You only have to show up. You only have to be genuinely curious. You only have to ask about the students and mean it. And drink the tea even when it is too strong. And come back next Sunday. And the Sunday after that. She counted every Sunday. Show up for the people who are counting.